Great. So it's my pleasure to introduce Hudson, who's going to be talking to us today about the multiverse hypothesis, the problem of evil, and the problem of the best.
Let me start by just thanking Mike and Sam for inviting me to participate in this conference. It is a fine thing to be among serious Leibniz scholars, so I'm enjoying it. I am not a serious Leibniz scholar, but I was asked to come and give some thoughts from a contemporary perspective that would revive the best world hypothesis as a way of engaging classical problems that are rooted in considerations of evil. So that's what I'd like to try to do. There is a handout. There are 10 propositions on the handout that are going to get referred to by name again and again, so you'll want to have it near you. Section 1, the problem of evil and the problem of the best. On the very day I defended my dissertation, April 30th, 1991, a tropical cyclone with winds exceeding 150 miles per hour slammed into southeastern Bangladesh. As one of the 10 worst natural disasters of the 20th century, the cyclone was deadly and devastating. Over 138,000 people lost their lives. Another 10 million were rendered homeless. Untold numbers of frightened, injured, and innocent animals suffered and died along with their human fellows. And yet the destruction and ruin of that cyclone is only a drop in the ocean of suffering that characterizes the history of our world. For tremendously long stretches of time, confused and terrified creatures tore one another, limb from limb, in a daily struggle to minimize the pain of hunger, earning nature her description of being red in tooth and claw. And for a briefer stretch of time, rational creatures have compounded the suffering in profoundly significant ways by bringing intelligence and cruelty to the table, dominating one another, and inventing astonishing and revolting ways to reveal new depths of suffering. And nature itself, not to be outdone, as we know from being here, has contributed a steady stream of floods and earthquakes, tsunamis and hurricanes, and if given just a little more time, is sure to throw in a comet or an asteroid strike to round it all out. Uncontroversially, there is evil. Attempts to pretend otherwise, either by mistakenly insisting that evils which are extrinsically good aren't evils at all, or by unreasonably restricting the application of the term evil to entire possible worlds rather than states of affairs in general, or by feigning skepticism about the existence of evil grounded in an inability to produce a compelling and full-blown theory of value. Attempts to pretend like that are simply not worth taking seriously. But problems for theism, rooted in considerations about evil, are very much worth taking seriously. Now, the overworked descriptions, the problem of evil and the problem of the best, have been employed so frequently and in such a diverse range of discussions that their invocation runs serious risk of equivocation. I'll avoid those phrases and concentrate instead on 3 puzzles for the theist that are prompted by reflections on evil, and each is presented as an inconsistent triad. They appear in your handout. Inconsistent triad number 1. 1, if God exists, there are morally justifying reasons for the evil of the world. 2, there are no morally justifying reasons for the evil of the world. 3, God exists. Inconsistent triad number 2. If God exists, the actual world is the best possible world. 5, the actual world is not the best possible world. 6, God exists. A third inconsistent triad. 7, if God exists, there is no infinite hierarchy of ever-better worlds. 8, there's an infinite hierarchy of ever-better worlds. 9, God exists. Now, some inconsistent triads, those in which the inconsistency is logical, consist of 3 propositions from whose conjunction we may derive a contradiction, and each of our triads has that feature. And so each presents us with the challenge of identifying and exposing one or more falsehoods amongst its trio of claims, for given their joint entailment, we do have guarantee that at least one proposition in each trio is false. Our 3 inconsistent triads share the third proposition, that God exists. So the atheist has an immediate solution to all the puzzles. And a straightforward argument against the existence of God can be constructed either on the foundation of a defense of 1 and 2, or of 4 and 5, or of 7 and 8. And of course, that has hardly been overlooked in the literature on atheism. But it is worth noting that the puzzles are independent from one another. And the atheist may adopt the logically possible package of accepting any one of the associated arguments for atheism while rejecting the other two. For example, one might think that although there is a best world, God would not be required to maximize value, and yet that some evils are unjustified, thus inclining towards the first atheistic argument while rejecting the second and third. Or, one might think God would be required to maximize, that all evils are justified, that there is a best world, but it's not this one. So you could be attracted to the second argument while rejecting the first and third. Or, one might think that all evils are justified, there is no best world, but instead there's an infinite hierarchy of ever better worlds, thus being attracted to the third while rejecting the first and second. So, again, the theist must battle on 3 fronts, and victory in 1 or 2 battles loses the war. In other words, the theist must successfully reject at least 1 of 1 and 2, at least 1 of 4 and 5, at least 1 of 7 and 8. And so in this talk, I'm going to acknowledge some familiar motivation for accepting those 6 theses. And this is motivation I think that should at least initially worry the theist. And then I'm going to explore the prospects of one strategy for confronting the trio of challenges, a strategy that exploits the notion of a best possible world and invokes the notion of a multiverse hypothesis. So the atheist's response, once again, to the inconsistent triads is to deny the third proposition in each, and the theist, qua theist, can't follow suit. But each of the other claims has initial, substantial pull on the theist, and that places her in an uncomfortable position. To appreciate the extent of that discomfort, I want to rehearse just why. So a bit of background. If God exists, God is essentially omnipotent, essentially omniscient, and essentially perfectly good. I'm not arguing for that, I'm presupposing, with some explanations, rough and ready, controversial explanations. By the phrase, God is omnipotent, I mean that God has it among his genuine alternatives to act in any way that's metaphysically possible for him to act. By the phrase, God is omniscient, I'll mean that at any time God knows each proposition that is true at that time. By the phrase, God is perfectly good, we'll have a hodgepodge of things. I'll mean that God never does anything morally impermissible. God is never morally blameworthy. God has all the virtues that is physically possible for God to have. Or if there are incompatible sets, God has one of the unsurpassable sets of virtues. And God is motivated, but not constrained, to produce good states of affairs and sustain them, and is motivated, but not constrained, to eliminate bad states of affairs, or to prevent them. All right, against that backdrop, consider some initial remarks in favor of 1, 2, 4, 5, 7, and 8. There's nothing comprehensive here, it's just enough to put the theses squarely on the table. And to be clear, I don't speak in my own voice in the next several paragraphs to follow. I pretend to be a proponent of each proposition in turn in order to give it a sort of forceful introduction into the dispute. So, initial remarks in favor of proposition 1, that if God exists, there are morally justifying reasons for the evil of the world. If God exists, God would know or foreknow what evil exists or else is about to exist without divine intervention by omniscience. God would be sufficiently motivated to eradicate or to prevent that evil unless there were morally justifying reasons to permit it by perfect goodness. God would be able to do what God knows how and is sufficiently motivated to do by omnipotence. That is, barring morally justifying reasons, pointless, gratuitous evil would not exist for long or would not exist at all. But history tells us an exceedingly long, violent, blood-chilling story knows no shortage of evil. So, if God exists, there are morally justifying reasons for the evil of the world after all. Initial remarks in favor of proposition number 2, that there aren't any morally justifying reasons. The assortment of theodicies on offer is dazzling. Their authors are ingenious, but at bottom the theodicies are bankrupt. As was famously remarked by Hudson, malt does more than Milton can to justify God's ways to man. Even an attempt as well championed as the free will defense has apparently insurmountable obstacles at every turn. And like all theodicies, it either fails to be compelling or it fails to be comprehensive. For example, the admittedly genuine goods secured by a community of free beings are far too modest and too meager to compensate for the millennia of horrific suffering among the innocent. Compatibilists deny that permitting such evil is necessary for freedom in any event. And in the absence of wholly implausible, speculative claims about the bad behavior of extraterrestrials or demons, force spacers, the free will defense could hardly be extended to account for the range of the world's natural evils. Moreover, our collective failure in theodicy is not for lack of trying. We've looked long and hard and competently for genuine candidates, and we have simply come up empty. Unfortunately, our history of careful and systematic theorizing should, perhaps unhappily, teach us at least one lesson, namely that if there were morally justifying reasons for the evils of the world, such as the Bangladesh cyclone of 1991, we'd be aware of them, and we would recognize them as morally justifying reasons. Honesty compels us to admit that we aren't aware of any, and such admission, combined with our conditional lesson, compels us to declare that there simply aren't any morally justifying reasons for the evils of the world. There's Proposition 2. Initial remarks in favor of Proposition 3, or I guess of 4, that if God exists, the actual world is the best possible world. If God exists, God knows which item in the plurality of possible worlds outranks all others in value by omniscience. God would be sufficiently motivated to actualize that best of all possible worlds, unless there were non-consequentialist, morally justifying reasons to create less than the best, by perfect goodness. And God would be able to do what God knows how and is sufficiently motivated to do by omnipotence. That is, barring such morally justifying reasons, God's knowledge, character, and power would ensure that the way things are actually surpasses all alternatives. Accordingly, since there are no such morally justifying reasons to create less than the best, if God exists, the actual world is the best possible world. Proposition 4. Initial remarks in favor of Proposition 5, that the actual world is not the best possible world. Look about. With any seriousness, and all Panglossian optimism quickly disappears. Perhaps you can talk yourself into a frame of mind where even the most revolting of history's moral horrors has some hidden but compensating good, and where ages upon ages of animal pain and suffering are properly permitted in accordance with some unknown, morally justifying reason or other. But no one should take seriously the suggestion that things could not have been in any measure better, that the omission of this or that bit of suffering would somehow have robbed the world of its title of being best, or that the addition of this or that moment of joy wouldn't have increased its value at all. And such omissions and additions are surely to be found amongst the possible alternatives. So Proposition 5. Initial remarks in favor of Proposition 7. If God exists, there is no infinite hierarchy of ever better worlds. Why? Well, if there were an infinite hierarchy of ever better worlds, every possible product of divine creation could be surpassed in value. But if every possible product of divine creation could be surpassed in value, God would not be essentially perfectly good. But essential perfect goodness is a non-negotiable feature of the conception of God. Accordingly, if there were such a hierarchy, the essential attribute in question would be impossible to satisfy, thus securing God's non-existence. There's 7. Initial remarks in favor of 8. There is an infinite hierarchy of ever increasingly good worlds. It's easy to sympathize with the intriguing and widely popular intuition that there's always room for improvement, even when things are already uniformly and perhaps even infinitely good. Just by adding more goods without introducing more evils, such that the previous goods comprise a mere proper subset of the latter goods. But let's postpone detailed considerations in favor of this proposal now. We'll be better positioned to appreciate them after covering a bit more ground below. Of course, each of the brief defenses above can be, and has been, challenged in any number of philosophically sophisticated ways. So now I'm back to my own voice, right after I said philosophically sophisticated ways. Now I'm back. Against 1. Not everyone agrees that each evil, or even the whole world package of evils, stands in need of a morally justifying reason to permit its occurrence. Perhaps some gratuitous evil is consistent with God's existence after all. Ben Inwagen sometimes talks this way. Against two, as attested by the present literature and philosophy of religion, theodicies continue to be introduced and refined and defended. And ever-growing numbers of skeptical theists are wholly unimpressed by the consequences of our failure to discover and expose morally justifying reasons to permit evil. Against four, apologists argue that an unsurpassable being can create a surpassable world. Against five, some optimists continue to maintain that despite considerable appearance to the contrary, a respectable case can be made for the thesis that our world ranks best after all. Against seven, the attribute may well be non-negotiable, but plausible refinements on the analysis of perfect goodness can effectively block the alleged entailment from perfectly good creator to unsurpassable creation. Against eight, we might agree that there's always room for improvement, but only size, shape, and aesthetics permitting. More on that point below. I'm hoping that that quick overview was familiar. Less familiar stuff soon. Section 2, a best possible world, the letter and the spirit. Let me begin in the middle of things with some remarks on our second inconsistent triad. The talk of God's actualizing a best possible world presupposes a number of potentially troublesome assumptions, a few of which deserve consideration and comment. First, there's the widely adopted view that God alone does not determine which world is actual, but that the community of free creatures shares in the responsibility of actualizing one of a number of worlds that are consistent with certain parameters that have been fixed by God's creative activity. Second, we can wonder whether possible worlds are the sorts of things that can be bearers of value, and whether, if so, the values of different possible worlds are always commensurable. Third, we can put pressure on the assumption that there are no ties for first place amongst the possibilia, that no plurality of worlds can be both alike in value and greater than all others, so that there is no best world, but only some unsurpassable ones. And that's related to this other point. Recall that the title of best will be unawardable if it should turn out that there's an infinite hierarchy of worlds where every world is bested by at least one other. These presuppositions do seem to lurk behind discussions of God's actualizing the best possible world. But the spirit of that proposal provides ways to accommodate some of those worries, without simply relinquishing the general strategy for atheism that's at issue. For instance, we could classify those aspects of the world whose presence seems due to the creative activity of God alone, whether or not some creatures participate in generating other features, and interpret propositions 4 and 5 in an associated, restricted sense, without blunting much of the force of the reasoning designed to support them. Similarly, without giving much ground, we can qualify 4 and 5 by replacing the term the best possible world with among the unsurpassable worlds, and thereby face a refined, inconsistent triad every bit as challenging as its predecessor. The remaining worry, though, I think is too difficult to dismiss quickly. Defending the thesis that worlds are universally commensurable is not a trivial task. I think it's true, but I think it's very hard to defend. But any exploration of that final assumption is beyond the scope of this talk. I'm here simply going to adopt the assumption of commensurability without argument, but only after a fair nod of acknowledgement to its centrality and to its capacity to considerably complicate the disputes and the discussion that follow. Quite obviously, demonstrating the hypothesis that there is, in fact, a best possible world would have a significant role in all three of our puzzles by combating propositions 2, 5, and 8 in turn. For if the hypothesis is true, then not only does 8 fall immediately, but the door is open to showing against 5 that our world is that world, and to showing against 2 that this designation goes a long way toward furnishing the morally justifying reason God needs for creating our world. But still, an open door is one thing, walking through it is another. Isn't it painfully obvious that ours fails to be best? What could possibly justify Panglossian optimism here? I think it's important to hear those questions as very different, significantly different questions. first, isn't it painfully obvious that ours fails to be best, rhetorically suggests that we're already in possession of good reasons for thinking our world is not the best. While the second, what could possibly justify optimism, hints that we're without any good reasons for thinking our world is the best. But those questions mirror two strategies, the first of which consists in affirming Proposition 5 outright, and then blocking the support that a denial of 5 would have provided for a denial of 2. While the second adopts the more modest aim of suspending judgment on 5, consequently on 2 as well. Nice distinctions aside, though, many regard the unsurpassability of our world as absurd, and they're happy to embrace Proposition 5 without much apology. Here's a hypothesis about why. When we focus on some unknown, horrid feature of our history, invoke our favorite argument from evil, with that horror as the centerpiece, and then argue for atheism, we're quickly drawn into a familiar battle about whether there's some known or unknown morally justifying reason permitting that particular evil. But win or lose that battle, suppose you lose that battle, it just seems obvious to many that all on its own, the presence of that horrific evil disqualifies our world from being the best. And it is that special honor, after all, that's under consideration in the current discussion. Maybe the evil is morally permitted, but it disqualifies our world from being the best. But I suspect that the identification of disqualifying horrors is the most popular reason for restricting application of the best to our world. But I think it's worth thinking about a brief story that suggests that that reasoning is too hasty. Here's the story. Suppose you have two very large baskets of apples. In the first basket, the apples are undiseased and blemish-free, but they're also tiny, unripened, pitiful examples of what apples can be. Free of certain defects, they also lack many of the features required for the finest apples. In the second basket, all of the apples are well-shaped, mature, and perfectly ripened. Selecting an apple from the second basket, you discover that it has a bruise on one side. Now, you may still think that each apple in the second basket, including the one in your hand that's bruised, is superior to any apple in the first basket on the grounds that although at least some are thus bruised here and there, the virtues that they share, even when combined with the defects, always outweigh the quality of even the best of the tiny and unripened lot. Should you also form the additional view that the apple in your hand is not the best of the apples in the second basket? That depends. It depends on your information about the other apples in the second basket. I've assumed that you know that the apples in the second basket share certain good-making features. But are you in a position to determine whether or not each such apple also has a bad-making feature equivalent to or worse than the bruise on the apple in your hand? That's a reasonable question to answer before proceeding. So there's the warm-up, here's the payoff. Suppose you have two large classes of worlds. In the first class, the worlds are free from horrors like Roe's dying fawn, Ivan Karamazov's Turkish soldiers, the Holocaust, but in lacking certain features, say creatures with free will, are impoverished examples of what worlds can be. Free of certain defects, they also lack many of the features required for the finest worlds. They're tiny apples. In the second case, all of the worlds share the good-making features lacked by those in the first class. Say the goods of free creatures in society with one another, or an absence of a massive irregularity in their laws, and you find yourself inhabiting a world from the second class, only to discover that it's marred by a horrific evil. That's the apple in your hand with the bruise. You may still think that each world in the second class, including your own, is superior to any world in the first class on the grounds that although at least some contain such horrific evils, the virtues that they share, even when combined with such defects, always outweigh the quality of even the best of the impoverished lot. But given your knowledge of that particular horrific evil, that bruise, should you also form the additional view that your own world is not the best of the worlds in the second class? It depends. It depends on your information about the other worlds in the second class. I've assumed that you know that the worlds in the second class share certain good-making features. But are you in a position to determine whether or not each such world has a bad-making feature, equivalent to or worse than the horrific evil found in your own world? And as before, that's an important question to ask before proceeding. And the answer may be harder to come by than is the answer about the apples, which of course can be had just for the looking. The ever-increasing skeptical theism literature is ripe with such maneuvers, stressing skeptical premises such as, for all we know, any world at least as good as ours contains some evil or other equivalent to or worse than that in ours. And it's an underappreciated feature of this literature that not only does it block inferences from inscrutable horrors to gratuitous, unjustified horrors, the sort of defense can be pressed into service again to block inferences from inscrutable horrors to disqualifying horrors for our world's being best. But still, such a modest defense doesn't give any positive grounds for Panglossian optimism. And thus a retreat from affirming 5 to suspending judgment about that proposition doesn't provide a solution to our second inconsistent triad. That achievement would require rejecting rather than suspending judgment on 5. So it would seem that what we need is some way to move beyond the bare hypothesis that there is a best world or some unsurpassable ones to a new and appealing line of reasoning that suggests not just that we don't know that our own world has that feature, but that suggests our own world may very well be the favored candidate for that office. A line of reasoning that is not as vulnerable to the withering criticism that has so often reduced its predecessors to little more than targets for satire. Fortunately, there have been some recent and intriguing attempts in just this direction, and surprisingly, where they can be seen to furnish a direct argument against Proposition 5, they also provide an independent, important way to engage 2 that does not, as before, depend on the success of pairing the case against 5 with the consequentialist assumption that it's always permissible to create the best. So Section 3, the new stuff, the multiverse. Recent literature in philosophy and physics has revived serious interest in the notion of a multiverse, by which I will mean any universe which is somehow or other sectioned into numerous divergent regions that vary independently with respect to their cosmic conditions. That is, with respect to facts about the number and nature and distribution of their fundamental entities, and facts about the number and nature and relative strengths of their fundamental forces. Moreover, it so happens that many competing theories which share these salient features, while differing from one another in significant respects, are live options in contemporary theorizing about the nature of the world. Alternative portraits of a multiverse include, 1, the countless David Lewis worlds. These are spatio-temporally and causally isolated universes that can be argued for on the grounds of theoretical unity and economy. 2, the plentiful domains of inflationary cosmology. 3, the abundant universes born of quantum vacuum fluctuations. 4, the ancient idea of an eternal return in an oscillating Big Bang, Big Crunch universe. 5, the modern M-theory speculation of a cyclical Big Splat, Big Bounce sequence for pairs of 3 brains that are floating in a multidimensional space. 6, the branching cosmoid, posited by many worlds' interpretations of quantum theory. And 7, near and dear to my heart, the infinite resources of a plenitudinous hyperspace or of a plenitudinous hypertime. They all have what it takes. In addition to the truly astounding variety of applications to outstanding problems in philosophy and physics, the exploration of the notion of a multiverse may also yield intriguing insights into our present discussion. Several authors have recently argued that the hypothesis of one or another multiverse either significantly mitigates or even wholly resolves one or more of our inconsistent triads in a theistically friendly manner. Critics, of course, vigorously contest those claims, and the remainder of the talk is just devoted to an examination of the promising prospects for engaging our inconsistent triads by appeal to a multiverse. Section 4, the multiverse and the second and third inconsistent triads. So how does the hypothesis of a multiverse help to provide a satisfactory resolution to the second inconsistent triad? Well, it strengthens the case for our worlds being the best, or among the unsurpassable, both defensively and offensively. When not in the grip of a maximizing conception of divine creativity, it's commonplace to think that there are several possible worlds worth creating, each a world above a threshold of some kind or other, each a world God would have been justified in creating were he to have made it actual. The threshold details are, of course, hotly disputed. Certainly nothing as crude as more value than disvalue will do. Nothing as exclusive as no disvalue of any kind will do. And owing to plausible distribution of good considerations, not even the deliberately vague and consequentialist valuable enough will do. Accordingly, in addition to having a certain balance of value over disvalue, perhaps the world's inhabitants may also have to enjoy, as individuals, a certain kind of value over disvalue in the lives accorded to them, or else individually receive adequate compensation for their own sufferings afterwards. Or perhaps they may have to consent in some manner to their condition, or be shielded from certain kinds of injustice, or be permitted opportunities to display autonomy, or have occasion to enter into special relations with others. But however the threshold details get resolved, let's begin by considering the standard alternatives to what we take to be our own world pre-multiverse theorizing. So think about the non-multiverse worlds, but just those worlds that happen to be above the relevant threshold. All and only worlds that would have been acceptable standalone creations. So you're going to exclude, for example, worlds with gratuitous evils, worlds without adequate compensations to individuals, and so on. The problem before us quite naturally arises from the following thoughts. One, God had to choose from among those alternatives. Two, the ranking of that choice is evident to us, its inhabitants. Three, it's inescapably obvious that things could have been so much better than this. But once the multiverse hypothesis is introduced, those three thoughts require re-evaluation. Given an appropriately diverse multiverse, each such alternative in our original class of candidates can be housed, so to speak, in one of the separate partitions of an appropriately structured multiverse. And thus, in a real sense, God did not choose between such goods, but could have them all. Moreover, our little window on the world, as inhabitants of the local partition, doesn't reveal enough of creation to leave us confident that its ranking is any longer accessible, much less evident to us. And finally, we're not asked to relinquish the claim, whose obviousness has always been the finest defense against Panglossian optimism, that things could have been so much better than this. It's just that the this now picks out only a sliver of the whole, and thereby doesn't have the undercutting force that it previously possessed. To be fair, there's still enough in the range of this to nominate certain events for the office of disqualifying horror, but then recall the scope of skeptical theism in the baskets of apple story. Doesn't the multiverse in question clearly stand out as the best of the worlds under consideration thus far? It's guaranteed to contain every good tendered by any one of its adversaries in the original candidate class, and, by hypothesis, everything else it layers on is worth having too. Before accepting that verdict, though, it's worth exploring the suggestion in more detail. What of the objection that it doesn't really get to the heart of the original problem? That is, the real perplexity is that given alternatives better than what we actually have, why wouldn't God bring about a rather different sort of partitioned reality instead? In other words, if multiverses are on offer, why shouldn't we expect a multiverse, each partition of which is as good as a partition could be, maxed out in value, rather than a multiverse that here and there contains above the threshold but unnecessarily rough neighborhoods like ours? I think the best answer for a proponent of the present strategy is simply that even though the independent partition of the proposed possible alternative would be at least as good or better than each of the independent partitions of the actual world, the world itself would be inferior. That's to say that local comparisons would favor the proposed possible alternative, the global comparison would favor the diverse multiverse. Scores of contributions to aesthetics and value theory have trumpeted the tremendous goods that can be contributed by such diversity. Far from being an ad hoc reply, it seems rather to be of a piece with reasoned verdicts of comparative value in many analogous settings. And on this view, the multiverse is governed by a generous plenitude principle, perhaps even provides a version of the great chain of being in which a token of every sufficiently worthy configuration consistent with God's nature is realized in some concrete way in some partition or other. Another worry. If dimensioning up was such a splendid idea, why stop at a multiverse, each of whose partitions is, as we have just been conveniently imagining, a four-dimensional alternative to what we thought, pre-multiverse, was our own isolated four-dimensional world? If the more the merrier is really the slogan of the day, why not a world of 5 or 6 or 7 dimensions, a multiverse itself partitioned into multiverses? Well, why not? It's easy at first blush to sense a reductio strategy there. But anyone who has been attracted by the line of reasoning thus far need not retreat just yet. Consider an intriguing passage from the pre-critical Kant. If it's possible that there are extensions with other dimensions, it's also very probable that God has somewhere brought them into being, for his worlds have all the magnitude and manifoldness of which they are capable. This Kantian reflection betrays some sympathy with the pointed issue, although Kant's speaking of higher dimensional spaces in that passage. His thought shares the salient feature of a multiverse of multiverses scenario. But his brief and straightforward explanation seems to take the sting out of the would-be reductio. It's because attention to the dialectical situation is crucial here. The problem of the best arises only when the theist recognizes a tension between two things that she's encouraged to take very seriously. First, ultra-strict limitations on world-making, given a maximizing conception of divine activity, and just how awful things seem to be wherever she happens to look. But the dialectical pressure to countenance a necessary connection between God's character and the unsurpassability of God's creation should, if it has any force at all, lead her happily to accept the invitation to climb on up the ladder of in-spaces or multiverse hierarchies. For example, if God really must create the best, and if a 32 space with multiple time dimensions really is metaphysically possible, then why, oh why, let all that good space go to waste? Fill her up. In short, there's something about the presuppositions of the original challenge that doesn't sit at all well with this manner of dismissing the present proposal for responding to it. A final worry. What of duplicate universes? What bars God from creating several qualitative duplicates of each partition that's worth creating at all? The possibility of duplicate universes has been raised in support of our Proposition 8, the ever better infinite hierarchy of worlds thesis. And the idea is that even something as grand as a multiverse of multiverses can be improved upon by the additional creation of duplicates of its many partitions, and that there's no upper limit on such improvement. The cardinality of any duplicates can be exceeded. And while not being unassailable, the pressure to increase both the dimensionality and the duplication of partitions as mechanisms for adding value to the multiverse strikes me as a credible reason to take the hierarchy version of the no best world thesis seriously. But then we can take cases. Case number 1. There is a best possible world or some unsurpassable ones. Now what? For the reasons noted above, it is, or they are, versions of a multiverse. Of course, questions would remain, for if so, then either there's a metaphysical ceiling limiting the number of dimensions and duplications, or else, for some reason, after a certain point, such additions don't increase the value of the world to which they're appended. Why not? Here are some guesses. Perhaps additional value is exhausted once there are proper class many duplicates. Perhaps value is captured in types, and once a type is tokened, a master artisan moves on. Perhaps value is wedded to the minimization of arbitrariness, and some numbers of duplicates are more arbitrary than others. One's better than 17, continuum better than 17 billion. In case 1 then, the judgment comes down against Proposition 5, and there's some residual puzzlement about why there aren't more dimensions or more duplicate partitions than there actually are. Case number 2, there is no best possible world, also unsurpassable ones. Well, what then? In this case, the theist signs off on Proposition 5 and resolves our second inconsistent triad by rejecting Proposition 4. The cost of the resolution, though, is that she must now squarely face the problem of no best world. In particular, she now needs to identify and defend a satisfactory reason for rejecting Proposition 7 in order to explain why there being no best world is not bad news for the theist who acknowledges God's essential perfect goodness. But I think that that's a doable task. So let's return, before we leave this section, to the question that opened it. How does the hypothesis of a multiverse help to provide a satisfactory resolution to the second inconsistent triad? Well, it makes its defensive contribution by finding a way to acknowledge and respect the popular judgment that things could have been better than this, while reducing the force of that observation to local rather than global commentary. The blunting of that judgment, together with the baskets of apples story, designed to prevent promotion of any known local horror to the status of disqualifying horror, aims at undermining our claim to know that our world isn't best. And moreover, it makes an offensive contribution by furnishing positive reasons to think that the multiverse provides a stage on which God can create everything worth having simply by partitioning goods, rather than being forced to sacrifice some goods to obtain others. And the defensive and offensive contributions together generate a case for rejecting Proposition 5 for resolving that inconsistent triad. Section 5, the multiverse and the first inconsistent triad. So how does the hypothesis of a multiverse help to provide a satisfactory resolution to our first inconsistent triad? The quick way. If one judges as successful the multiverse resolution of the second triad by way of refuting Proposition 5, then that victory can be carried over to an immediate strategy for objecting to Proposition 2 in the first triad. If our world is the best, then unless there are overriding non-consequentialist considerations at stake, securing that very status is itself the morally justifying reason that God needs to permit the evil of our world. But noted above, the multiverse hypothesis provides resources for engaging Proposition 2 that are wholly indifferent to the vexed question of whether or not a multiverse is best or unsurpassable. So I want to turn to those. Recent work in this area I think has been promising but has been underdeveloped. It's very hard to see, initially, how a multiverse could be invoked to argue not just for ways things could have been better, but as a source of new morally justifying reasons for inscrutable horrors. But that's exactly what the multiverse has the potential to do. Whether or not a particular horror has an extrinsic feature, such as a compensating good, depends crucially on the kind of environment in which it is embedded. And the multiverse enhances that environment considerably. Even if a particular evil would have been gratuitous, if the local environment in which it appeared were the whole of the universe, it may yet be compensated for once located in a mere portion of that whole. For instance, recall the proposed threshold consideration, that the very same individuals who suffer are the individuals who must be compensated for that suffering. If one or another multiverse scenario opens the door to such compensation, as does, for example, the plenitudinous hypertime scenario, then the options for morally justifying reasons will have been significantly enriched. There's thus an additional consideration here that cautions us about the sorts of lessons that could be learned from the baskets of apples story. A choice of fruit, if restricted to a single apple, had better come from the second basket. For despite the bruises on each such apple is superior to every undeveloped apple in the first basket. But if a choice of fruit can be an entire fruit basket, it'll probably be time to add some apples from the first basket to the second on the grounds that they can improve the whole. That is to say, whereas if God's choice of creation were limited to a single non-multiverse, only the first class of worlds we originally considered, those that passed that threshold standard on their own merits, would be genuine candidates. But if creation choices extend to multiverses, then some partitions, which wouldn't have made it as solo projects, because, say, some evil would then have gone unjustified, are eligible for reconsideration and inclusion on the grounds that they have some other good-making feature. For example, a sort of aesthetic value, which arises only in conditions inhospitable to life, a feature not worth making actual at the expense of sentience, but certainly, decidedly, a feature worth having for free. And moreover, it's much easier to see how a multiverse hypothesis has the potential to play a further role in a defense against Proposition 2. Recall that second set of initial remarks that I made to motivate Proposition 2. It went like this. Our collective failure at Theodicy is not for lack of trying. We've looked long and hard and competently for genuine candidates. We've simply come up empty. Unfortunately, our history of careful and systematic theorizing should, perhaps unhappily, teach us at least one lesson, that if there were morally justifying reasons for the evils of the world, we'd be aware of them, and we would recognize them as morally justifying reasons. Honesty compels us to admit that we aren't aware of any, and such admission, combined with our conditional lesson, compels us to declare that there simply aren't any. Well, that remark endorses a no-see-em inference. We don't see them, probably not there. A representative example of which shows up on the end of the handout. I called it BC. If there were a morally justifying reason for permitting the Bangladesh cyclone in 1991, then we'd be aware of it and we would recognize it as a morally justifying reason. Well, sometimes we unhesitatingly accept conditionals that satisfy that pattern. Like in this case, if there were a severe pain in my head, I'd be aware of it and I'd recognize it as a severe pain in my head. You betcha. And sometimes we say yes, but our confidence isn't that high. If there were a tiger stalking about this room, we'd be aware of it and we'd recognize it as a tiger stalking about this room. And sometimes we don't feel any inclination to accept the conditional at all. If there were a dietary reason for the presence of these 26 coils in the recovered alien spacecraft, then we'd be aware of it and we'd recognize it as a dietary reason. And sometimes we absolutely reject these conditions. If there were an object too complex for us to be aware of, we'd be aware of it, and we'd be able to recognize it as an object too complex for us to be aware of. Certainly not. So what should we make of BC? Into which category does it fall, and why? And I, for one, don't find it especially persuasive. The brief remarks in favor of BC, given twice above, suggest that our grounds for endorsing the no-see-em inference come from a long, hard, careful, systematic investigation that came up empty. Of course, no one pretends to have examined all the candidates for morally justifying reasons. For such candidates are states of affairs, and their infinite number quickly outruns our collective investigative capacities. Rather, the idea is that we have a justifyingly strong inductive generalization allegedly supported by a large and representative sample of the whole. And again, should BC manage to be secured in this fashion, the defense of Proposition 2 in the first inconsistent triad will be impressively compelling. Why, though, are we supposed to concede that the sample in question is representative? If we have good reason to believe that the sample is unrepresentative, the strategy for defending the conditional won't get off the ground, and there are seriously promising reasons of that sort to consider. But there's no need to aim high to defend reasons that strong. Even if we ratchet down and maintain only that we have no good reason to believe that the sample is representative, or that we're in the dark or in doubt about whether the sample is representative, the inductive argument is still in jeopardy. And so-called skeptical theists are in the business of denying premises like BC in just this manner. In general, they argue either that we have no good reason to believe, or else that we're in the dark about whether the goods we are aware of are representative of the goods that there are. And the situation gets worse. In these discussions, it's common to simply spot ourselves a remarkable ability, namely, that we can recognize a morally justifying reason when we run into it. After some reflection, though, it seems obvious that we should drop this conceit, for it seems little more than sheer bluster. We have no good reason to believe, or else we're in the dark about whether the entailment relations we know of between goods and permitted evils are representative of the entailment relations that there are. So we may already have discovered an exceedingly valuable good that would justify God in permitting this or that evil, and then, after failing to recognize its necessary connection to the evil in question, mistakenly rejected its candidacy on the grounds that it didn't require permission. And our situation gets even worse. For we have no good reason to believe, or else we're in the dark about whether, the degree of value we recognize in those goods that we are aware of is representative of the total degree of value that those goods manifest. Consequently, we may well have already discovered a good that would justify God in permitting this or that horrific evil, and also have already recognized its necessary connection to the evil in question, and then, after failing to recognize its full range of goodness, mistakenly rejected its candidacy on the grounds that it was not sufficiently compensatory. Thus, argue our skeptical theists, no good reason to think that if there were such a compensating good or some other morally justifying reason for the world's horrific evils, we would be aware of it. Or if it were somehow an object of mere awareness, that we would be able to recognize its full degree of value or its function as a morally justifying reason. So to return just for the last paragraph to the theme of this talk, whether or not those observations convince you to relinquish support for Proposition 2 in the first inconsistent triad by way of appeal to BC, it would seem that seriously countenancing a multiverse hypothesis should decrease one's confidence in the support that BC lends to 2. The suggestions that we have good reason to believe that the goods we're aware of are representative of the goods that there are, or that we have good reason to believe that the entailment relations we know of are representative of the entailment relations that there are, strike me as wishful thinking. But once the multiverse hypothesis is on the scene, we have even less reason to think our knowledge of goods and entailment relations is representative, since the salient features of the other partitions are inaccessible to various kinds of inquiry and inspection by those of us confined to this one. Whereas we're not simply entitled to populate the hypothesized partitions with all the exotic goods that we like, we should at least recognize that the range of candidates, for morally justifying reasons, may be both far too large and far too opaque to acknowledge adequate support for Proposition 2 in the first inconsistent triad by way of an inductive generalization defense of BC. Thank you.
Sam.
Great. Thanks so much, Hud, for that really clear and engaging talk. I guess I'm still struggling to see what the multiverse hypothesis adds, as opposed to a more sophisticated version of just the best possible world hypothesis. So particularly with respect to the second inconsistent triad. So you said, if I understood you, 2 points in favor. What it gives us is 2 points, one more defensive. We get to acknowledge this popular judgment. Things could have been better than this. And we can do that by making a distinction between global and local partition comparisons. But I would have thought, of course, the good old-fashioned defender of 5 would have said something very similar, distinguishing instead of partitions, simply regions or locales or, I don't know, proper parts within the world, and made the very same move. So I'm not sure how the multiverse does anything more than that in terms of blunting the objection. And then you said there was a second nice thing that it gives us in an offensive sort of way. Here's me, I'm paraphrasing now. Something like, it shows how God can realize otherwise incompossible fundamental entities. So it kind of appeal to the good of plenitude of a certain sort. It just occurred to me, I mean, one, you might think, well, yeah, maybe that is better. There's a cost, especially for Leibniz, right? There's a certain lack of organic unity that the multiverse will have over a really fecund world. The multiverse looks like a kind of aggregate in a certain way. Beyond the fact that I guess they all exist. But more to the point, it's just not clear to me how that really is germane to addressing the concern that pressured us to deny 5 in the first place. So it might be, this seems like just a separate fight, in other words, over whether we should want incompossible, otherwise incompossible fundamental entities to be realized in actualia. Maybe yes, maybe no, but I'm not seeing how that helps with the problem of evil kind of stuff. So can you say a bit more about that?
Okay. On the first part, why not just have one big, huge world? Why bother with the partitioning? If you do, you have to fight an extra battle. So here's a thesis. The laws are really universal, every place laws. And if I discover them in my local environment, I can extrapolate. And that's what's happening over there, no matter how far away the there happens to be. On the other hand, if the multiverse is supposed to be distinguished in virtue of its partitions differing in their fundamental features, then the laws I discover here, and the regularities that I then invoke and abuse to show that this isn't as good as things could be, are not ones I can extend to all of actuality. So I don't have to have the extra fight that at some great remove from here, but in some distance I might measure in Leibniz, the fundamental forces are otherwise. That's something of an advantage. And I can also get perhaps more partitions in certain kinds of multiverses than I can get just subsections of dividing up our space-time. I might get a broader range. So there's the one thing. The last part of the question was, why would I even care? Why would I have a desire to add on these extra things? And I think I'm supposed to come to the realization that I would care very much when I'm told it won't cost you anything. You just have to have some room to put those objects and those events. And you thought they were good to begin with. You just didn't think they were as good as something else. But why not have it for free? If what I'm doing is trying to maximize value, and I introduce no new disvalue, and I get something good for free, I'll take it. Good, yeah.
Absolutely. So I agree with that second point entirely. I guess what I was failing to see is how that dispute is helpful to the theodicist who's trying to block the second triad. So, maybe it is better to have the multiverse in the way you just suggest, for the reasons you just suggested. But how does that helping undermine the concern that got us to deny 5 in your initial story, say? I'm just not seeing
So when someone says, won't I have to deny 5, and you're hearing me say, you might not have to deny 5. I give a story to you in which 5 will seem more plausible than it did moments ago. So the story is, your inclination to deny 5 comes from thinking that there are very clear ways that we could improve on what we have. The encouragement is, what we have is now being construed in a limiting way. You're thinking that what we have is exhausted by what's available to us in this partition on the assumption that there is a multiverse. What we have is oh so much grander than that. And if that were your reasons, they now disappear and you can feel sympathetic towards 5 again. Does that help? Okay, sorry.
Okay, Jeff?
My question, to be honest, is almost eerily similar to Sam's.
I was actually reading over his shoulder.
I was going to show you. I didn't write it down. Maybe one quick follow-up then on the first part of Sam's part. It doesn't seem like the laws are really the problem, right? It's not that the problem of evil isn't being generated because I thought, gee, wouldn't it be better if the laws of nature were different? So I wonder how much of an advantage the multiverse, by saying, well, it opens up some ranges of possibility in that respect, is really going to help much. And then, so I had the same intuition that Sam had, was how much is the multiverse sort of really helping out rather than spelling out the same thought that we should have seen, for example, already in Leibniz, that really the local versus global distinction. But I'll pass on from you.
Let me try, because I saw Sam's furrowed brow. I'm happy to have a second shot at this question. I thought it would have something to do with the laws, because I was imagining the opposition coming like this. Our world would have been much better if it had had this extra moment of joy, or if it had been absent that little bit of pain. And then I try to tell myself a story according to which I can take out just that local objectionable feature or intrude some bit of happiness. And then I think, this is related to Tim's point this morning, that's not an easy surgery. And as soon as somebody starts pressing me, it may very well turn out that I need to say very different things about the fundamental structure of the universe to do it. I thought then, as soon as it became clear that that would be my task, that people would want me to back off it, because I wouldn't be able to meet that task unless I have partitions where those things already come pre-equipped with fundamentally different structures. So my guess was, when somebody appeals to something, without talking about laws, saying it would have been better if, that there will be a little line we can trace from that suggestion to a difference in the laws, and then the multiverse partitions differing with respect to their laws will give me what I was hoping I would be able to achieve when that task is pressed on. So even if people don't announce their thoughts about how things could be improved that way, I thought it would boil down to them. And laws now will be crucial. Yeah.
Mike?
So it seems to me that the best world hypothesis, as you've developed it, is going to be useful, to me anyways, only if it's going to have some only if it's going to have some sort of theological utility, and in particular, only if it's going to have some utility in a theodicy that I can endorse. But then I think about how this fits with my theological beliefs and with the project of theodicy as I'm inclined to do it. And I realize, so for example, I hold fairly traditional Christian beliefs. It doesn't seem to me that the first human sins or Jesus' death on the cross could be of salvific relevance to people outside our partition. Right? They're causally isolated from us. So then I think, well, maybe then your multiverse hypothesis implies that the traditional doctrines of Christianity are strictly false. That is not theologically useful to me. More helpful, maybe the multiverse hypothesis implies that the traditional doctrines of Christianity are true when the quantifiers are restricted to our partition. Okay, that's okay. I might be able to fit in stories about the other partitions into an overall theology that I find useful and interesting. But now the question of utility for theodicy becomes pressing. Because if I take the whole Christian story with the quantifiers restricted to our partition, restricting the quantifiers still to our partition, I don't have a best world hypothesis anymore. And so now I have only the resources of our partition, of what's true in our partition for constructing a theodicy. And the problem of evil question is just, has God been perfectly loving toward or perfectly good toward our partition? And it seems to me that your multiverse hypothesis doesn't help with that problem. And so either it conflicts with my theological beliefs, or it's not useful to me in constructing a theodicy.
So that was great.
Hey, Hud, can I interject just briefly?
Please don't.
Please don't completely steal my thunder. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Just raise your,
There's more multiverse to come.
Tim, raise your hand if I get close.
Okay.
Very, very quickly, I think your standards for it being a help to you were too high. Here's one way it can be of help to you. There are 3 straightforward atheistic arguments on the table corresponding to triads, and the multiverse can help you get rid of propositions 2, 5, and 8. That's thumbs up for it. But your thought may be, it helps me, but it hurts me. And the way in which it hurts me makes me want to resist the offer of help. So then you had the question, kind of dilemma. What is it? Is it restricted to the partition, or is it something that can bleed into the other partitions? And then you quickly dismiss that second one. I think maybe I'd want to explore that. So there are some varieties of multiverse where you'll have the feature that you hinted at that made you think I was going to have to go with the other one. And the features of the multiverse prevent any kind of interaction between the partitions of one and the partitions of another. It may not be true of the oscillating Big Bang, Big Crunch, for example. You might think that there are causal seeds that survive the conflagration, but that's not the one I had in mind. Your point might rule out using Lewis words to do the work, because you can't cross partitions. But it may not rule out plenitudinous hypertime, where one and the same group of individuals can appear in a fully realized space-time block at a later hypertime moment and go on to have further episodes that are hypercausally related to their previous lives in a different space-time block. Now, I know that sounds wildly speculative, but that is why I was invited here. And the thought is, your consideration, your dilemma, may show that certain multiverse hypotheses that nobody introduced thinking were going to help with Christian doctrines will be excluded from any longer being the ones we'll choose between, but others are still left in the mix.
Andrew?
Well, the tradition of taking one another's questions continues. So Mike had it much better than I did. Let me just follow up by saying, if we're thinking about the multiverse in terms of Lewisian worlds, then 5, as you stated, isn't quite right, because if we've got an indexical theory of actuality, it's not going to help. With 5, you're going to have to change it to something like the existing world or multiverse, even though many of those worlds aren't actual, or many partitions aren't actual, is not the best possible, and you could reject that, right? Is that the...
Just really quickly on that point. 2 things are true of Lewis. One, that he thinks that these plurality of worlds exist. And second, that he thinks that he can appeal to it to give a reductive analysis of modality. I can accept the first suggestion without buying into the second. So suppose I still accept actualism, not Lewisian possibilism.
Okay.
But I think his ontology is correct. I just don't think that the existence at a world, which isn't one of my world mates, is mere possibility. Then I can use the framework to propose a multiverse without arguing for it the way Lewis did.
Okay, so you just reject the indexical theory,
Yeah.
and then you can keep 5.
David?
Space-time is a very prominent feature in process theology.
Good.
And there are some parallels, I think, because the classic development of best of all possible worlds for a process theologian is that this is the potentially best possible world. And it's only through the building of the kingdom of God in the here and now that it can actually become the best possible world. So it's a movement in space-time from one thing to another. So there are some parallels, I think, between what you're saying about the multiverse and what is, in many ways, quite a well-established theological way of looking at this particular issue.
That's interesting. Let me ask a question if you know about that will help me think about it. When I try to think that our world has the potential for being the best possible world, and it depends partly on what happens next.
Yeah.
I think of something like this. I have a growing block theory of space-time, and I have the possible worlds as abstracted, and there are a range of those possible worlds which have already been eliminated from the office of being this possible world. But there's still a range with more than one item that still counts as a candidate. Now, do I say this? It's indeterminate currently which possible world, abstract object, is the one that will be satisfied by the flesh and blood place that we inhabit. If I put it that way, then I think, sort of in connection with this idea about having hopes, that we can hope that things progress in such a way that we manage to fill out the complete description and get the title best at the very end if there is such an end time. Is that the way to think about it? It's indeterminate, or is there a different way of thinking about it? Indeterminate which proposition our world will satisfy.
I'm not actually sure of the answer to that. I'll have to have notice to think that through.
Let me ask you more about it later, because I'm
Okay.
interested in that.
Yeah.
I've heard that before. I
Yeah.
want to think about it.
Okay, let's go to Dan next.
Couple of points. First of all, on your third inconsistent triad,
Yeah.
it's worth noting historically that Malebranche actually did believe that there was an infinite hierarchy of ever better worlds, and that was not inconsistent, obviously.
And that it was
That was not inconsistent with the existence of God.
good.
And you might want to look at how it is that he justifies it.
Mhm.
There's a debate between Leibniz and Malebranche over exactly this question that I think winds up turning on what it is that you count as a good possible world or the best possible world.
Thank you.
So in the end, it may turn out not to be philosophically deep.
So,
But,
just quickly, Malebranche will be my man who will reject seven.
yeah.
Good, thank you.
But I want to stand up for the atheist.
Okay.
And it does seem to me that the way in which this looks, or this may look to an atheist is, on the traditional argument from evil, the cost of theism is recognized as somehow or another having to deal with evil in the world. You may have a solution to that, but it's at the cost of what may appear to be very bloated metaphysics. Now, there certainly are people who would want to accept the multiverse idea anyway.
Yeah.
But my sense is that, or one I think could make the argument that, if the main motivation is winds up to be to answer the problem of evil, that may be too high a cost in comparison with the much simpler atheist answer, which is to reject 3, 6, and 9.
Good. I love paying for the resolution of puzzles in ontology. I think that's exactly the way to go. But I might be getting even more for my ontological buck than solving the problem of evil, which isn't a minor problem. I mean, if someone said,
If you're a theist, it's not a minor problem.
good. But I'm trying to imagine how the theist might be attracted to the multiverse, and I have just one hook so far. Maybe it will help you, common theist, with the problem of evil, which has bothered you for so long, but it will help you in other ways as well. I was nodding when Mike was saying he wasn't seeing how it might come in to play other roles as well, but I think the multiverse, or certain variants of it, might help you with the next problem of eternality as a divine attribute for God, and how to talk about something that's very much like timelessness, but that doesn't rob God of personhood or consciousness or agency. The multiverse can help with other principles about divine creativity. The multiverse, although I don't want to go into details, I promise to after, can help you become a literalist about a variety of topics that you might have thought you simply have to be historicized given the contemporary modern worldview and so on. So it can do more for you than tease out a certain kind of response to evil. But still, I want to recognize that not everybody thinks ontological costs are worth even that basket of goods.
From the point of view of an atheist, though, this just adds, one might say, to the implausibility of the theist hypothesis, is to say, well, the costs are even more than one might have thought.
Right. Imagine the atheist says, I know what I will do. I will solve by rejecting 3, 6, and 9. But imagine the atheist wants company and says, I'd like to get you, theists, to do that too. So I agree that the atheist won't pay these costs. I'm encouraging the theist to resist the atheist's invitation to reverse convert by paying these costs.
Let's go to Catherine next.
Okay.
So I'm worried that what you have given us with one hand, you have taken away with the other. You have given us the possibility that this world is the best, but I'm worried about your rejection of DC.
Okay.
Because while I have to agree with you that there are many entities of which we are not aware and will never recognize, morally justifying reasons seem to be a bit peculiar. I think I would also agree that there can be morally justified reasons for things of which we will never be aware or recognize because we go extinct before we have recognized them. But it seems to me that the person who's seriously perturbed by the problem of evil is really demanding a reason that is morally justifying, of which they are aware and can recognize as a morally justifying reason. That's what's really bothering them.
So I think that that's a pretty good diagnosis of what's really bothering me. Don't tell me that it's beyond my ken. Tell me what the answer is. And if you don't do that, you won't satisfy me. And I understand that cry. I would like to respond to it, but I want to hope for second best. Suppose I can't. Suppose I trot out my favorite list of theodicies, and each time the two of us thinking hard about them together say, that's not it. What else do you have in the bag? And I run out of things in the bag. I now want to aim for this achievement. You don't have to go atheist yet. So you have one desire that can't be satisfied. Let's suppose that we're forever ignorant of the right answer to the question, what is the compensating good, if there is one, for the Lisbon earthquake? Should my discovering about myself that I am eternally ignorant of the right answer to that question incline me even a little bit toward the atheistic position rather than the agnostic? I think that the talk I was just giving can help me with that second best goal, even if you turn out to be right and you couldn't help me with the first best goal, and that was really what my audience cared about most. Do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, well, I'm just
Okay.
still worried about the status of DC here.
Okay.
But, well, let me think about this some more.
Let me say one, because I forgot that you would draw attention directly to that. BC makes a really tremendous claim. It says if a certain kind of thing exists, then two other things would be true. I'd have awareness of it and I'd be able to correctly identify its function. But there are so many everyday examples where I simply reject that tremendous prediction about my powers of identification and proper classification. And this looks like it's exactly the sort of topic where I should have a kind of intellectual humility. I'm not up to that task.
Yeah, but I don't know, because as I said, I agree with you about
Yeah.
the entities, but there's something about morally justifying reasons that ties them to us
Mhm.
and the way we think about the world. As
Mhm.
Locke would say, it's a mixed mode, it's our input that makes something morally justified. And
So I want to agree about that. Suppose that whatever would be a serious candidate for being a morally justifying reason for harms that I am the individual who suffers. Suppose it would have to involve certain properties of mine, that they're relational properties, that will involve states of affairs that not only can I not evaluate, I can't even entertain. If that's right, I shouldn't move from the claim that I'm a constituent in the state of affairs that turns out to be the morally justifying reason for my harms, to I have access to it. That's my thought. But I want to grant that I'll bet it involves me.
Okay, that's all the time we have for questions. So let's end for speaker.
Thank you.